Hey dude, what's up? We meet again. I'm kidding. Hi, beautiful people of the internet. I've been so excited to sit down in this chair and talk to you guys. I've been looking forward to it all day, which is kind of silly considering that at the end of the day, I am sitting in a room talking to myself. I'm sorry if I'm yelling into the microphone. I also had a ton of caffeine today, so be aware. Hope all of you guys are doing well. I hope all of your weeks are off to a good start. Today's case is a well-known case, but one that has had a lot of arguments surrounding it. And I can't wait to hear what you have to say because I can kind of see it from both sides, but we'll explain once we get into the nitty-gritty. All right, you guys, you ready? Does everyone have your snack of choice? Is everyone driving safely? If you are, eyes on the road. Let's go. In 2002, 27-year-old Laci Peterson was 8 months pregnant when she vanished from her home in California. What followed was a nationwide search that ended in heartbreak when the bodies of Laci and her unborn son were discovered. Scott Peterson, her husband, was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death in 2004. For years, the public saw this as a clear-cut case. It just made sense. There were really not that many questions to begin with when this all began. But in the 2 decades since, a growing number of people have started to question Scott's guilt. There is a huge argument these days on whether or not you believe Scott is guilty or he's innocent. There are also a lot of serious concerns about whether or not Scott truly got the fair trial that he deserved. As time passes and new details continue to surface, more and more people are left with the question, was Scott Peterson a killer or was he just the most convenient person to pin it on? So let's discuss. There is a lot to go through. Wait, mic check before we get started because I'm a bit traumatized from last episode where I recorded the whole thing and it didn't record. Okay, we're good. All right, let's go. The morning of December 24th, 2002 was Christmas Eve. Laci Peterson was supposed to be spending the day preparing for holiday celebrations with her family. She was 8 months pregnant at the time and very excited to welcome her first child, a baby boy her and her husband Scott had already named Connor. That morning, around 9:30 in the morning, Laci's husband, Scott Peterson, had left their house to go fishing, and according to him, when he left, Laci was still home. Their morning was nothing unusual. It was just like any other morning. Laci had been in the kitchen. She told Scott about her plans for the day. She was planning on baking cookies, I believe, taking their dog Mackenzie on a walk, and she was getting ready pretty much the entire day for the family dinner later that night. Mr. Scott, on the other hand, had been deciding whether he wanted to go fishing or he wanted to go golfing, but he ended up deciding to fish. So after saying goodbye to Laci, goodbye to the dog Mackenzie, he headed out to make the 90-mile drive to Berkeley Marina. Around 10:15 to 10:30 in the morning, neighbors reported seeing Laci and Scott's dog walking around by itself in the neighborhood. The weird part is that he was alone, but also the leash was still attached to the dog. And when one of those neighbors, a woman named Karen, saw the couple's golden retriever alone outside dragging its leash, she realized that she knew who the dog belonged to. So she returned him to the Petersons' backyard, closing the gate behind him. She didn't see Laci, she didn't see Scott, but she wasn't necessarily looking for them. She was just returning the dog safely by putting him in their backyard. A few hours went by, and around 2:15, Scott called Laci to let her know he was going to be heading home. He mentioned not having time to pick something up and asked her if she would mind going if she could find the time.
Beautiful. I just left a message at home. 2:15. I live in Berkeley. I won't be able to get to the Villa Farms to get that basket for Papa. I was hoping you would get this message and go on out there. I'll see you in a bit, sweetie. Love you. Bye.
Scott Peterson reportedly claimed that he got home from his fishing trip around 4:30 in the afternoon. When he got home, he said he entered through the side gate. He noticed their golden retriever in the backyard, still with a leash on, and brought the dog inside. He also noticed that Laci wasn't home and saw that her car was still parked in the driveway. After bringing the dog inside, Scott continued to take off his clothes. They were pretty dirty from going out fishing. He threw them in the washing machine. He started a load of laundry, grabbed a slice of pizza. He was feeling a little bit hungry, ate it, and then took a shower. After that, with still no sign of Laci, Scott decided to walk over to a neighbor's house to ask if they had seen Laci, but they hadn't. So Scott decided it was probably a good time now to call Laci's mom to ask her if she had seen or heard from Laci, considering they had plans to meet for dinner later that night. Laci's mom had not heard from her, and that call really worried not only her, but also Laci's stepfather, Ron, because by that point, hours had passed with absolutely no communication or sight of Laci. And they had reason to worry about her these days a little bit more than usual because she was 8 months pregnant. So after failing to get a hold of her and realizing that she hadn't communicated with anyone for hours, her stepdad, Ron, decided to call 911 and report Laci Peterson a missing person. Now, to give you a little bit of background, Scott and Laci met in 1994. They were both attending college at California Polytechnic State University. I think it was love at first sight. They fell head over heels for each other, and only 2 years later, the couple got married. They bought a 3-bed, 2-bath house in a nice neighborhood in Modesto, California, and began their happy little life as a newly married couple. Laci got a job working as a part-time substitute teacher, and Scott was working for Trade Corp USA, which was a fertilizer company. And then in 2002, Laci got incredible news that she was pregnant. She was so excited to become a mom, and it was all that she could talk about, really. Early on in the pregnancy, Laci and Scott picked out their baby boy's name. They were going to be naming him Connor. And they were so excited to meet this little boy in Laci's belly that was already so loved by Laci's family and friends. But the idea that their loved ones would never get to see the day that baby Connor was born was one that nobody could have seen coming. When the call came in reporting that Laci Peterson was missing, Modesto police detectives Alan and John were the ones who responded. They were taking this pretty seriously from the beginning. It was Christmas Eve and a pregnant woman had gone missing. By the end of the night, they would become the lead investigators in what would soon become a big national story. When they first arrived at the Peterson home, Scott met them at the door. He looked, considering, pretty calm and looked to be ready to cooperate with the police. He let them in and kind of did a run through of his day, where he had been, what he was doing. He told them that he'd spent the day fishing alone at the Berkeley Marina, nearly 90 miles away from the house. But again mentioned that when he left, Laci was still at home and she was planning to spend the day baking, cleaning, etc. The detectives did a quick walkthrough of the house and nothing really seemed out of place, at least not at first glance. But in the closet, they found Laci's keys, her wallet, her sunglasses, her purse. All of the things that she would normally take with her, they were just sitting there. Red flag, immediate red flag. Before the sun set that night, police were already organizing a search. Right off the bat, in their eyes, it was clear that something was off. Something wasn't adding up. A pregnant woman does not just leave her house without her purse, her keys, and especially her phone. She also doesn't just leave the house when her dog is alone walking through the neighborhood with its leash still on. So the detectives asked Scott to walk them through the day, detail by detail with timestamps. And that is when the timeline began to unfold or unravel, depending on who you ask. Scott told detectives that he last saw Laci that morning, around 9:30 in the morning. That morning, she had woken up around 7 in the morning, and before he left, she was getting ready to take the dog Mackenzie out on a walk. He said they exchanged a quick goodbye, nothing unusual. Then he loaded some things into his truck and headed to his warehouse, which was where he kept his boat. He left approximately around 9:50 a.m. Scott said he stopped at the warehouse to get the boat, to get it prepped to go with him to the Berkeley Marina, to go fishing on Christmas Eve, alone. And he said he was at the warehouse until around 11 in the morning. At 11:15, he drove to the Berkeley Marina. We know that he was at Berkeley by 12:54 p.m. because he had a ticket to prove so. At 2:15 p.m., he called Laci and left her that voicemail, letting her know that he was on his way home. A weird detail in that phone call is when he left the voicemail, and I think he may have also sent her a text as well. He says, "I'm leaving now, it's 2:15, which is a little unsettling because it's kind of like he wants to make sure that you know what time he's sending that text. It's 2:15, I'm on my drive home. At 3:25 p.m., he made a final stop at a gas station before driving the rest of the way home. By the time that he got home that evening, again, it was around 4:30, 4:45 p.m., and Laci was already gone. The dog was in the backyard, leash still attached, and the house was quiet. It was 5:17 p.m. when Scott finally called Laci's mom, 5:47 when the stepdad called to report her missing, and 6 p.m. by the time officers showed up to the Peterson home. In the early hours of Christmas morning, Scott Peterson sat down with investigators for his first formal interview. They talked to him a little bit before, but this was his official first interview. And how did that interview go? Well, Detective John, who is now retired, later reflected on that moment. He said that Scott's demeanor didn't really match the situation that he was in. He wasn't panicked, he wasn't desperate, he was actually, considering the situation, pretty chilled out. The detective stated, quote, "He wasn't asking the questions you would expect. Usually when someone's loved one goes missing, they're flooding us with questions. What are you doing? Where are you searching? Who have you talked to?" But with Scott, there was none of that, end quote. And less than a week after Laci disappeared, on November 30th of 2002, Modesto detectives were hit with a bombshell. A woman, she was from Fresno, a massage therapist named Amber Frey, came forward. She had something authorities were definitely going to want to hear. Amber Frey was Scott's girlfriend. He had been dating her for just a little bit over a month, and according to her, Scott told her that he was single. However, this wasn't by choice, really. Scott had confided in Amber and told her that he had previously been married, but claimed that his wife passed away, and he just recently became a widower. Of course, detectives jumped in their car and raced to Fresno to meet with Amber in person, because what they found out was not only a lead, it was a turning point, really, for the entire investigation. Former Detective John would later say that Amber's memory was razor sharp. It was like something out of a Hallmark movie, he said. She remembered everything, the dates, the conversation, even down to what they were wearing, end quote. Amber laid out all of her cards on the table. She wanted to waste no time. She wanted to give them all and any information that she had about her and Scott's relationship. She described their entire relationship from beginning to end. That had only been going on for the last month. I think it was a little bit over 30 days. She said they met through a mutual friend, the mutual friend who was also under the impression that Scott was single. She described their romantic dinners, all of their dates, everything that he had said, thoughtful gestures that he had done, and described Scott to be a man who painted himself to be available and honest, and most importantly, unattached. With this new massive piece of information, police were desperate for any clue that would help bring them closer to finding Laci. Police asked Amber if she would be willing to record her phone calls with Scott, and she did not hesitate for a second. She said yes, and for the next 4 months, police would listen in on these recorded phone calls, waiting for him to slip up. And if detectives didn't have Scott on their radar prior to learning this new information, they definitely did now. But actually, while we're on that point, police did have a reason to suspect that Scott knew more that he was letting on. Not necessarily because of the way that he was acting, but more so because of the way that he wasn't acting. I mentioned before that his lack of concern was noticeable, but there were also random little things that made him look a little bit sus. For example, going fishing alone on Christmas Eve. A little odd, okay? You can't really tell me that that isn't a little bit random to go fishing and leave your pregnant wife alone at home to prep for the holiday family dinner. He also couldn't remember random little details about his fishing trip, like what kind of bait he used. He seemed more concerned about detectives taking pictures of his boat rather than concerned about his missing wife. He sold Laci's car not too long after she disappeared. He started talking to people about selling their home, and he also asked detectives, get this, he asked detectives if they were planning on using cadaver dogs during the search. And investigators were like, no, not really. We don't usually bring in cadaver dogs until we know that a person is dead. Do you know something that we don't? And Scott said no further questions, basically. There was also a little bit of discrepancy because a couple of people on Laci's side of the family mentioned that Scott had told them that he was planning on playing golf that day on Christmas Eve. Not fishing, but golfing. A neighbor also recalled that Scott had told them that he had been golfing that day. But when police brought that up, Scott explained that he had been planning, he was considering both options, planning on either golfing or fishing, but he decided that it was too cold to go golfing, which is why he went fishing instead. But even after clearing that up, Scott told detectives the kind of fish that he was out fishing for, and they remember also thinking that that was weird because it was apparently the wrong season for that kind of fish. Former Detective John recalls that Scott was, quote, a strange combination of polite and arrogant, disaffectedly distant, and impatiently irritable. He just didn't seem like a man who was crushed or even greatly disturbed by his wife's disappearance and possible death, end quote. Anyway, I kind of got a little bit sidetracked there, but point being, early suspicions were stacking up for authorities, and when they found out the one piece of information that Scott hadn't volunteered, his affair, it was looking like things were about to start getting really messy. And prior to Amber coming forward, Laci's entire side of the family was on Scott's side. They did not suspect him for a second. They loved Scott. They considered him family. They were so happy for him and Laci and the beautiful little life they had created. They were counting down the days until her due date to celebrate baby Connor coming into this world. And they did not think for a second that Scott Peterson would have harmed their daughter. But upon learning about his affair, Laci's family was quite quick to change their opinions on Scott, and rightfully so, because if he was capable of that kind of betrayal, who is to say that his plan hadn't been to get rid of Laci completely so he could, I guess, run away and live happily ever after with his girlfriend? Add to that the fact that he had taken out a life insurance policy on Laci 2 years before she disappeared, which isn't unusual for a married couple to have life insurance, but when you learn that Scott attempted to cash it out just days after Laci's disappearance, it really starts to raise serious suspicions against him very quickly. When Amber spoke about her relationship with Scott to detectives, it was quite clear that it was quite new. They had only been seeing each other for a month. That being said, they were getting pretty close pretty fast. Scott had met Amber's child, he had a key to her house, and he had even spent the night before at her place, which I don't know what he was telling Laci, his pregnant wife, when he was sleeping over at Amber's house, but we know that he did. And the two of them even talked about meeting each other's family, even getting married, and Scott telling Amber that it would be a privilege if he got the chance to step in and act like a father figure to her child. Which is why you can understand that Amber was absolutely appalled when she learned that her boyfriend was also somebody's husband. The mutual friend that had introduced the two of them was the first to find out that Scott was married, and they told Scott that he better come clean to Amber. And he did, but again, he said that he was a widower. He claimed that he was married, but that his wife had passed, and told Amber all about how upset he was that this would be the first Christmas that he would be spending without his wife. And then on Christmas Day, when his wife's face was all over the news, everyone realized that Scott was married and that his wife was now missing. Amber called Scott over and over and over again on December 26th, and he did not pick up that phone once. 4 days later, Amber received a call from a friend informing her that her boyfriend was now being looked at as a person of interest in his wife's missing persons case. And not even 5 minutes after that phone call ended, Amber called the police right after to report the affair. The plan was that Amber was going to record her phone calls with Scott for police to listen in to see if he said anything that may raise a red flag or anything that could be seen as suspicious. And remember, by this point, Scott had no idea that Amber knew who he was. And you guys, you would think that your wife being missing and her face alongside of your face being splattered all over the news, you would think that you would probably come clean to your girlfriend, right? Like, you not because you wanted to, but because you would probably be scared that she would see your face on the news. And if you had any respect for your girlfriend whatsoever, you would probably want her to find out from you, right? Wrong. Scott went back to calling Amber and chatting regularly as if nothing was wrong. On New Year's Eve, Scott called Amber. He told her that he was in Paris watching the fireworks at the Eiffel Tower, thinking about her and spending the holiday with his friends. He sounded happy. He told her that he missed her and told her all about how unbelievable Paris was. And it certainly was unbelievable because Scott was not in Paris. He was in California. He was at home. And when he called her, he was at a vigil for his missing wife with all of his family members and all of her family members. He called his girlfriend minutes before his wife's vigil was starting, while his wife's family was walking around trying to find him. What do you mean, Scott? What do you mean? Actually be so for real. On January 24th of 2003, the Modesto police press held a conference. It was in that conference that the public found out for the very first time who Scott's girlfriend was, because up until that point, she hadn't been named. But in that conference, a tearful Amber Frey walked up to the mic and announced who she was. She said that she met Scott Peterson November 20th of 2002, that they were in a romantic relationship, and that she wasn't a suspect in the case. She said in fear of compromising the police investigation, she was not going to be commenting further. but she told reporters that she had not known that Scott was married and that Laci's family had her sympathy. She also prayed for Laci's return home. With Amber Frey now in the picture, police felt confident that they finally had something solid. They didn't need to find Laci's body yet. Don't get me wrong, it was still a priority, but with Amber, they were now able to start building a solid case against Scott because now they had a clear motive. All of California hated Scott Peterson by this point. Nobody aside from his parents was standing by him, and you have to admit, it was starting to look pretty damning for it. I know that if this was happening today and I saw all of this evidence on the news, I would also be on the same side of not being a fan of Scott Peterson. In an interview, Scott was asked if he was a person that brought his affair to police's attention, if he was the one that told the officers, and he immediately said yes, said that he told them the day that he realized Laci was missing, but that wasn't true. And after the interview, Scott called them back and said, "Actually, I lied. I didn't tell police about my affair." However, he did hold on to a story that he did tell Laci, and that obviously, he said that she obviously was not happy about the fact, but claimed that it was something in their marriage that they were prepared to work through. Honestly, he made it sound like it really wasn't a big deal. The person interviewing him asked him, was there much anger from Laci's side? And he said, no, not really. Like, it was weird how casual he was about the whole thing. It was like weird. And I find that hard to believe because, first of all, a woman who was 8 months pregnant carrying your baby wouldn't just be like, oh, you have a girlfriend. Oh, you've been cheating on me for a month. You know what? That sucks, but it's okay. That's fine. What? Hello? Again, be so for real. Nearly 4 months after Laci Peterson vanished on April 13th of 2003, a passerby walking along the shoreline of the San Francisco Bay saw something that I would imagine would engrave trauma into your head for the rest of your life. They saw the remains of a baby boy lying along the rocky shore. The umbilical cord was still attached to the little body. Just one day later, another dog walker stumbled upon the body of a woman nearby. Her body had washed up on shore, not far away from the first location, only about 8 miles away from the Berkeley Marina, where Scott Peterson claimed that he had gone fishing on Christmas Eve. That location, however, was nearly 90 miles away from the Petersons' home in Modesto. The baby was almost eerily preserved, and as for the woman's body, what remained of her was hardly recognizable. She was a little bit more than a torso. Her head, hands, and feet were missing. Majority of her organs had been removed. Her ribs had been fractured. Duct tape was still left on her upper thighs. It was awful. And it painted a really terrifying picture. Forensic teams were able to extract DNA from both bodies, the baby's and the woman's, and the results only confirmed what investigators were already suspecting. The woman was Laci Peterson. The baby was baby Connor. His DNA matched samples not only from Laci's family, but also from a court-ordered blood draw Scott had given weeks earlier. The autopsies on both bodies were performed by a forensic pathologist, but unfortunately, because of how severely decomposed the bodies were, a cause of death could not be determined. They were also not able to tell if little baby Connor was born while Laci was still alive or not, nor if he had been born alive or dead. However, some injuries on Laci's bodies were consistent with showing that she likely had something tied at her wrist and or her ankles used to sink her down to the water, to submerge her in the water where she had been for months. Meanwhile, investigators were dealing with that horrific discovery. Another group of law enforcement officers were still very actively keeping an eye on Scott. They pretty much had to have an eye on Scott at all times, which they probably should have done a better job at. You'll see what I mean when I say that. But at this point, it goes without saying that Scott was their main suspect. They conducted search warrants for his house, his truck, his boat, and his warehouse. The boat was very important for them to look at closely because what would make the most sense for the storyline that they were starting to put together was that Scott likely killed Laci elsewhere, put her body on the boat, drove to the Berkeley Marina, and ultimately disposed of her body in the water. And there's a few reasons why this theory made sense in their head. For one, he told some people that he went golfing when in reality he went fishing, which was weird. Two, the boat that he had only purchased weeks before Laci disappeared. And 3, he had gone out of his way to obtain a fishing license only 4 days before Laci disappeared. And that license was only good for 2 days. Only good for 2 days, and only good for him to fish at the Berkeley Marina. Weird. And when they searched his boat, this theory of theirs was only looking more and more plausible. On Scott's boat, detectives found a homemade anchor. Yes, it was homemade. A simple, round, concrete mold with a metal loop set into the center. A makeshift anchor. And while that alone may not have raised red flags on its own, it was certainly adding to their suspicions, and even more so when investigators also discovered concrete dust in Scott's workshop, as if he had made more of these homemade anchors, but only one was found in the boat. And the question investigators couldn't shake was, what happened to the others? Also relevant to know, by the way, Scott purchased 90 pounds of concrete, but could not remember what he did with the rest of it. 90 pounds is crazy. Search dogs were eventually brought in to help with the investigation, and they alerted to Laci's scent on a blue tarp found in Scott's workshop, as well as near Berkeley Marina. By April 18th of 2003, authorities thought they had more than enough circumstantial evidence to build a solid case against Scott. And with that, he was arrested just as he was pulling out his golf clubs out of a Mercedes vehicle. Scott Peterson was found in the parking lot of a golf course in La Jolla, California, very, very close to the Mexican border. He claimed that he was meeting his father to just play a round of golf, but the course that they were at was an over 6-hour drive from his house in Modesto. And when officers took him into custody, they found his appearance and belongings pretty unsettling. Scott had dyed his naturally dark hair lighter. It kind of looks almost as if he tried to bleach it. His car contained camping gear, survival equipment, nearly $15,000 in cash, multiple cell phones, hundreds of sleeping pills, many Viagra pills, which is disgusting, his license and his brother's license. To police, it looked less like a golf day out and way more like someone who was about to run away in Mexico. Scott's explanation for the entire thing was that he changed his look because he didn't want people to recognize him because he was getting so much public hate, and he drove 6.5 hours to go play golf for that exact same reason. But I don't know, Scott. It was looking more and more suspicious by the second, and finding him with all of that definitely did not help his case. After his arrest in La Jolla, officers drove Scott Peterson back to Modesto. It was a quiet ride, no sirens, no dramatic chase, just the slow, steady return of a man now at the center of a national firestorm. Once they were back in town, Scott was booked into the county jail. He was charged with 2 counts of murder, one for Laci and one for their unborn son, Connor. The charges included premeditation and special circumstances, meaning the prosecution could pursue the death penalty, and they did. When asked how he pleaded, Scott answered with 2 simple words: not guilty. On June 1st of 2004, after more than a year of headlines, heartbreaks, and speculation, Scott Peterson's trial finally began. But it didn't happen in Modesto because of how relentless media coverage and the emotional weight the case carried in Laci's hometown. The judge ruled that Scott couldn't get a fair trial there. So the entire proceeding was moved to nearly 90 miles away to Redwood City in San Mateo County. The prosecution was trying to prove that Scott killed his wife to go and be with his girlfriend. It was their belief that he suffocated her at home, wrapped her body in that blue tarp, and disposed of her body at the Berkeley Marina. And not long after the trial started, a witness testified, one that would impact the case heavily. Amber Frey took the stand. In front of a packed courtroom and a jury hanging onto every word, she told her story about falling for a man who she thought was single, about the whirlwind romance, and about the moment she learned that he was not only married, but that his pregnant wife had just vanished. Amber, just like she did with the detectives, laid everything out on the table for the jurors. The dinners, the lies, the manipulation, and most damning of all, the recordings from their phone calls. This was massive because not only had the prosecution been trying to prove how calm and not concerned Scott had been throughout the entire thing, but now jurors were listening for the first time for themselves just how easily Scott was able to manipulate. Scott's voice played in that courtroom, and it was eerie. It showed the jurors a completely different side of Scott, and honestly, just how easy and just how good he was at lying. With that in mind, though, we have to remember that the prosecution did not have a murder weapon, did not have a cause of death, no witnesses, or a definitive motive. All they had really was circumstantial evidence. The defense was trying to prove that Scott did leave the house that morning of December 24th to go fishing, but it was their claim that somebody kidnapped Laci while he was gone, held her in captivity, and then killed her. Two of their main points were that Scott's boat was too small to fit himself, Laci, and a block of concrete without it tilting over, and that the prosecution didn't have any forensic evidence to support their claims. They claimed detectives zeroed in on Scott because of his affair and decided early on that he was their guy, completely ruling out any other possibilities. The jury deliberated for 7 tense days. Behind closed doors, I can only imagine there were so many different emotions and different opinions that surely clashed. I say that because 2 jurors were ultimately dismissed. The first to go was a woman accused of doing her own research outside of the courtroom, which is a massive no-no and a clear violation. The second was the original jury foreman. He held degrees in both medicine and law. He took meticulous notes and requested hundreds of pages of evidence, but some jurors felt that he was just kind of in the way, overcomplicating things, so they eventually voted him out. His replacement was a firefighter and a paramedic, someone who during much of the trial was quite opposite of the guy who was removed. He was quite chilled out. He honestly looked to be a little bit bored in the courtroom. But once they replaced that juror, in just 7 hours, the jury reached a verdict. They made it a point to say that Scott definitely had a lack of emotion throughout the trial. They pointed out that he had no visible grief, no anger, just an odd emptiness almost. And on November 12th of 2004, Scott Peterson was found guilty. He was convicted of first-degree murder of his wife, Laci Peterson, and the second-degree murder for their unborn son, Connor. The jury believed that Laci's murder was premeditated. They thought that it was carefully planned, and baby Connor's was seen as a devastating consequence of that plan. He was sentenced to death. However, years passed, but Scott Peterson's case felt like it was far from over. In 2012, 7 years after his conviction, Scott's legal team filed for a formal appeal, claiming that he had not received a fair trial. They pointed to issues with jury selection, questioning whether the panel had truly been impartial, and they argued that in a case as explosive and as emotional as this one, finding unbiased jurors had been nearly impossible. It took years for the court to listen to his appeal, but in 2020, Scott Peterson's death sentence was overturned by the California Supreme Court. It was overturned after deciding that the original trial judge made a mistake when jurors were picked out for the trial. And as the years went on, it felt like more and more cracks began to form in the foundation of the case, at least in the eyes of some. When Scott's death sentence was officially overturned in 2020, it reignited a firestorm in questions, not just about the penalty, but about the verdict itself. Because there's a growing group of people who believe that Scott Peterson might actually be innocent, or at the very least, that the full story has not been told. In October of 2020, the California Supreme Court made a decision. They ordered a lower court to re-examine Scott Peterson's murder convictions and decide whether or not he should be granted a brand new trial. For many who had followed the case for years, this was massive news, and for Scott's supporters, it seemed to come down to one person, Rochelle Neese, a juror once nicknamed Strawberry Shortcake because of her bright red streaks in her hair. During jury selection, the jurors were asked a series of questions, including whether or not they had been involved in a lawsuit or considered themselves a victim of a crime. Rochelle had checked no, but that really wasn't the whole story. According to Scott's current attorney, Pat Harris, has said, "It's pretty clear she lied to us straight to our faces," end quote. And as it turned out, Rochelle had been involved in 2 domestic disputes, one of which included a restraining order against a man she accused of threatening her and her unborn child. So the thing there being, if Rochelle had a personal experience of a man threatening her and her unborn child's life, Would that kind of play into her being a juror in Scott's trial and possibly only the possibility of only finding him guilty because he reminded her of the guy in her situation? So she kind of would have wanted to get revenge on men that are being accused of threatening women and their unborn children. Do you see what I'm saying? Question being, is it possible that she saw herself in Laci and found Scott Peterson guilty because of her own personal experiences? Prosecutors, however, argued back. They said that Rochelle didn't intentionally lie to the court, she just didn't consider her situation in her past to be relevant. But now, a judge would have to decide, was the jury tainted? And if so, does Scott Peterson deserve a new trial? Meanwhile, outside of the courtroom, Scott's family was not staying quiet. In March of 2021, 48 Hours interviewed Scott's sister-in-law inside of what she called her war room, which was basically a room that she had been working in and had collections of documents, timelines, and theories that, in her words, proved Scott's innocent. His sister-in-law's theory points to a burglary that took place directly across the street from the Peterson home on the very same day that Laci Peterson disappeared. According to the sister-in-law, that wasn't just a coincidence. She believes that Laci may have seen something, she may have tried to confront the burglars, and that moment turned deadly. And maybe they were the people who killed Laci. Her main point driving her claim was that witnesses, apparently allegedly, saw Laci walking in the neighborhood after Scott had already left for his fishing trip, which, if true, would mean that Scott could not have killed her because he was already out of the house and at Berkeley Marina and Laci was left back at home. Scott's defense team admitted that some of these witnesses were not called during the original trial because most of their stories either conflicted with each other or were just flat out considered unreliable. But retired Detective John, who helped convict Scott, still isn't buying it. He still says there were no credible sightings of Laci that morning, not a single one. And according to him, several other pregnant women in the neighborhood looked similar to Laci, so it would have been easy for someone to mistake one of those for being Laci Peterson. On April 27th of 2021, Scott Peterson appeared in court. Not in person, he was there virtually, sitting remotely. He faced a status hearing on whether or not he would get a new trial for the death penalty. Months later, on December 8th of 2021, the court made its decision. Scott Peterson was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the deaths of Laci and their unborn son, Connor. The death penalty was thrown off the table. Then, in 2024, a new chapter began because the Los Angeles Innocence Project stepped in to take up Scott's fight for a fresh trial. They secured a judge's approval for his legal team to access evidence that had never been seen before, plus permission for additional DNA testing. Scott and his supporters continue to insist that the wrong man is behind bars for Laci and Connor's deaths, but retired Detective John remains skeptical. Well, he says, I guess it's possible, but there are still people out there who believe the earth is flat too. As of mid-2025, Scott Peterson's legal battle continues to unfold, and I guess we will see what comes from it, but I'm so eager to find out what your guys' opinions is on this case because, guys, I don't know, I can see it from both sides, but, one side of me is duh, he did it, look at all the evidence that points to him, but then again, we've seen cases where it looks like there is an obvious person, and then it turns out it wasn't that person at all, because all it takes is one piece of information for the entire story to be changed. And do they have that information or not? I guess we'll have to find out. I do want to end this episode by remembering the victims of today's case, Laci Peterson and baby Connor, 2 lives that were taken away from this earth far too soon, and 2 who left holes in the hearts of many. All my love really does go out for Laci Peterson's family, and I hope that they one day can get the closure that they so deserve. That is all I have for this video. Thank you guys for spending time with me today if you got to the end of this video. I cannot wait to listen to all of your thoughts and opinions on this, and I will see you guys in my next episode. I hope you guys are having the best day. If not, go do something to make it the best day. Make somebody happy, and I will see you in my next video. Massive kiss on the forehead for every single one of you. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of I Wish You Were Here. As a reminder, you can listen to this podcast anywhere you get your podcast. Video version is also available on YouTube. Love you guys.